He called me a cog. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just took the supply chain and let the company starve. My name is Mara Keene. For 10 years, I was the invisible backbone of Trionex Dynamics, a leading manufacturer of specialized materials for the aerospace industry. I'm the person who made sure that when engineers designed something impossible, the materials to build it appeared as if by magic. I'm the woman who knew every customs official from Buenos Aires to Singapore by name. I'm the reason planes built with our components stayed in the air. And on a Wednesday at 9:17 a.m., I became the reason Trionex Dynamics ceased to exist. That particular Wednesday began like any other. The conference room on the 14th floor was filled with the usual suspects, department heads clutching coffee mugs, junior executives trying to look important, and Nathan Drake, our newly appointed COO, standing at the head of the table with the projector illuminating his crisp white shirt. Nathan had been with us for exactly 3 months. He'd arrived from some tech giant with a reputation for disruption and aggressive optimization, corporate speak for firing people and squeezing suppliers. The board had brought him in to modernize operations after our founder retired. What they meant was they wanted higher quarterly returns, even if it meant dismantling everything that made the company work. I sat quietly in my usual spot. Third chair from the left, notepad open. I wasn't a department head or a C-suite executive. My title, Senior Supply Chain Integration Specialist, was deliberately understated. It kept me invisible, which was exactly how I preferred to operate. Q3 projections are concerning, Nathan was saying, clicking through slides filled with red arrows and disappointing numbers. We need to streamline operations across all departments. I knew what was coming. I'd seen this presentation before at other companies. It always ended the same way, with layoffs disguised as right-sizing and supplier squeezes masked as vendor rationalization. Supply chain costs are out of control, he continued, stopping on a slide that highlighted my department in angry red. We're paying premium rates for materials that should be commoditized by now. That's when I felt the first tremor of something dangerous awakening inside me. The materials we sourced weren't commodities, they were specialized alloys, developed through years of relationship building and trust. They were the reason Trionex components were 23% lighter and 41% more durable than anything our competitors could produce. I raised my hand. Those rates reflect proprietary formulations, and Nathan cut me off with a wave. Everyone thinks their department is special. Mara, that's the problem with this company. Too many people protecting their little kingdoms. The room went quiet. I felt eyes darting between us, the uncomfortable tension of colleagues witnessing something they shouldn't. I've reviewed the contracts, he continued. We'll be consolidating suppliers and renegotiating terms across the board, no exceptions. Some of those contracts have non-transferable clauses, I said quietly, particularly our Argentinian supplier. That's when it happened. Nathan Drake looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of condescension and dismissal. Look, at the end of the day, you're just a cog in the wheel. Mara, a replaceable part. We appreciate your input, but these decisions are being made at a strategic level. The room fell silent. I felt heat rising to my face, not from embarrassment but from a cold, clarifying anger. I didn't show it. Instead, I smiled politely, closed my notebook, and nodded. Of course, I said. Just trying to provide context. The meeting continued, but I was no longer there mentally. Instead, I was thinking about the small workshop in Salta, Argentina, where Gabriel Morales and his team created the aluminum-lithium alloy that made our flagship Skystrata components possible. I was thinking about the contract I'd personally negotiated a decade ago, the one with my name specifically listed as the authorized representative. I was thinking about how Nathan Drake had just made the biggest mistake of his career. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I simply began to plan. The first thing you should know about supply chains is that they're built on relationships, not just contracts. Paper can force compliance, but it can't create quality or inspire priority treatment when things go wrong. In an industry where a single delayed shipment can halt production for weeks, relationships are everything. I joined Trionex Dynamics 12 years ago, when it was still a hungry upstart trying to break into the aerospace materials market. Back then, we couldn't compete with the giants on scale or price, so we had to offer something different innovation. Our founder, Richard Treon, was an engineer with a vision for lighter, stronger materials that could revolutionize aircraft design. What he didn't have was a reliable way to source the rare elements needed for his experimental alloys. That's where I came in. I had spent the previous 8 years working in international logistics for mining operations across South America. I knew every bureaucratic labyrinth, every regional supplier, every port authority from Tierra del Fuego to the Panama Canal. Richard hired me to build something that didn't exist yet, a supply chain for materials no one else was consistently sourcing. It took me 2 years to find Gabriel Morales. His workshop in Salta wasn't much to look at, a converted warehouse at the edge of the city, staffed by a small team of metallurgists who had trained under Gabriel's father. What made them special wasn't their equipment or scale, but their proprietary method for processing certain rare earth elements into stable, aviation-grade alloys. Gabriel was turning down contracts from bigger companies when I found him. He wasn't interested in becoming another anonymous supplier in a giant's catalog. He wanted his materials to matter, to be part of something innovative. It took me 6 visits to Salta and countless late-night conversations over yerba mate before he agreed to work with Trionex. The contract we eventually signed was unusual. It named me personally as the company representative and included a non-transferability clause that required Gabriel's written approval for any changes. Richard had been willing to accept these terms because he understood something fundamental. This wasn't just a supplier agreement. It was a partnership based on personal trust. Over the next decade, Gabriel's alloys became the foundation of our most successful product lines. The Skystrata components reduced aircraft weight by nearly 20%, resulting in significant fuel savings for airlines. As Trionex grew from a promising startup to an industry leader, our relationship with Gabriel's workshop remained unchanged, personal, direct, and deliberately protected from corporate bureaucracy. When Richard retired last year, I should have seen the warning signs. The board brought in executives from outside the industry, people who saw our company as a collection of assets and liabilities rather than a network of relationships and innovations, but I had grown comfortable, perhaps complacent. I believed the system I'd built was too valuable to dismantle. Until that Wednesday morning, when Nathan Drake called me a cog. I left the meeting and returned to my office, closing the door behind me, something I rarely did. My hands were steady as I opened my computer and began systematically downloading key documents, the original contract with Gabriel, correspondence proving my role as the designated representative, shipping schedules for the next 6 months. Then I drafted 2 emails. The first was to HR, a standard 2-week notice citing personal reasons for my departure, professional, cordial, unremarkable. The second was to Gabriel, written in Spanish as always, asking for a video call that evening. I didn't mention my resignation. That conversation needed to happen face-to-face, even if digitally. Over the next 2 weeks, I performed my duties with meticulous care. I updated documentation, held knowledge transfer meetings with my team, and prepared handover notes that appeared comprehensive while strategically omitting the personal elements that made our supply chain work. The fact that Carmen at Customs in Buenos Aires needed documentation in a specific format to expedite clearance, or that shipments from Salta should never be scheduled during the local festival of Pachamama when everything slowed to a crawl. No one suspected anything was amiss. Nathan barely acknowledged my resignation, simply nodding and saying they'd find a suitable replacement. My direct supervisor seemed genuinely sorry to see me go, but was too overwhelmed with his own survival to ask many questions. My team gave me a small farewell lunch on my last day, presenting me with a framed photo of all of us at the company retreat the previous summer. I felt a twinge of guilt looking at their faces. They weren't responsible for Nathan's arrogance. But in the corporate game, collateral damage was inevitable. I had made my decision the moment Nathan uttered those fateful words. As I packed my personal items on that final Friday, I carefully placed the original signed contract with Gabriel into my bag. Technically, it belonged to the company, but I knew no one would notice its absence until it was far too late. The digital copy in the system had all the essential terms, but lacked the handwritten annotation in the margin initialed by both Richard and Gabriel that specified my personal role. I walked out of Trionex Dynamics at 5:23 p.m., just another professional making a routine career change. No dramatic exit, no burned bridges visible to the naked eye. Just a woman with a decade of institutional knowledge and one irreplaceable contract walking quietly into the warm evening air. The demolition of Trionex Dynamics had begun, and no one had heard the first explosion. My first week of unemployment was deliberately uneventful. I took long walks in the morning, caught up on reading, and politely deflected the inevitable LinkedIn messages asking where I'd landed. To all outward appearances, I was taking a well-deserved break between positions. In reality, I was waiting. The call came exactly 9 days after my departure. Julia Chen, VP of Operations at Lyra Forge Manufacturing, reached out through a mutual connection. Lyra Forge was a smaller player in the aerospace materials sector, known for their innovative approach, but hampered by supply chain limitations. They couldn't access the same quality of raw materials as the industry leaders, which kept them relegated to secondary status despite their technical prowess. "We've admired your work at Trionex for years," Julia said when we met for coffee. "Your supply chain integration is legendary in the industry." I smiled modestly. "It's all about relationships. That's exactly why we want to bring you on as a consultant," she continued. "We have the engineering talent, but we can't seem to break through certain barriers on the sourcing side." "What specifically are you looking to improve?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Our alloys aren't quite achieving the performance benchmarks we need for the next generation of components. We're missing something in the formulation or processing. Our current suppliers have taken us as far as they can." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the challenge for the first time. "I might be able to help with that. I have some ideas about alternative sourcing channels." We spent the next hour discussing terms. I would join as a high-level consultant with unusual autonomy. My contract included performance bonuses tied directly to improvements in their material quality improvements. I knew were guaranteed once I connected them with Gabriel. I signed with Lyra Forge the next day. Within a week, I was on a plane to Argentina. Salta hadn't changed much since my last visit. The same mountains rimmed the horizon. The same colonial architecture graced the city center. The same rhythm of life played out in its plazas and markets. Gabriel's workshop, however, had grown. New equipment filled the expanded space, and his team had doubled in size. Gabriel embraced me warmly when I arrived. At 62, his hair had gone completely white, but his eyes still held the same intensity and curiosity that had drawn me to him a decade ago. "Mara, it's been too long." His English was heavily accented but fluent, the result of years of technical conversations with international clients. "I'm not here for Trionex," I said after the initial greetings. His expression shifted immediately. "I suspected as much when you asked to meet in person. What happened?" "Over mate and facturas." I explained everything: Nathan's dismissive attitude, the planned supplier, rationalization, and my decision to leave. Gabriel listened without interrupting, his face growing progressively darker. "So they think they can simply replace you and continue as before?" he asked when I finished. "They do. And the contract," I pulled the document from my bag and placed it on the table between us, "still has the original terms, including the clause that names me personally as the authorized representative." Gabriel studied the paper, running his finger over the handwritten note in the margin. "Richard understood the value of trust," he said quietly. "These new people, they think everything can be reduced to transactions." "Exactly. And now I need to ask you for something significant." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You want me to enforce the contract terms, to deal only with you?" "Yes, but there's more. I've taken a position with Lyra Forge Manufacturing. They're smaller but more innovative, closer to what Trionex was when we first started working together." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "You want me to supply them instead?" "I want you to consider it. Their engineering is exceptional, but they've been held back by material limitations. With your alloys, they could create something truly revolutionary." For the next 2 hours, we discussed the possibilities. I showed him Lyra Forge's technical specifications, their design philosophy, and their vision for the future. By the time we finished our third round of mate, Gabriel was intrigued. "I'll need to meet with their technical team," he said, "and review their quality control processes. Of course, they're prepared to send people whenever you're ready." Gabriel nodded slowly. "And Trionex? They still have 4 shipments scheduled for the next quarter." "That's your decision," I said carefully. Legally, you could cease shipments immediately since I'm no longer with the company. But I understand if you want to provide some transition time. He studied me for a moment. You want them to feel the pain gradually, to understand exactly what they've lost. I didn't deny it. They called me a replaceable part. I want them to discover how wrong they were. Gabriel's smile grew wider. Then we will teach them together. I will complete the next shipment. It's already in preparation anyway. But after that, Trionex Dynamics will need to find a new supplier. We shook hands, sealing the fate of my former employer with a gesture as old as commerce itself. That evening, I sent Julia an encrypted message. Partnership secured. Prepare your engineers for a site visit to Salta next week. The demolition charges were now in place. All that remained was to watch the structure fall. Back in the United States, I settled into my role at Lyra Forge with methodical precision. My official title, Strategic Supply Chain Advisor, gave me broad latitude to reshape their sourcing operations. I began by conducting a comprehensive audit, identifying weaknesses and inefficiencies throughout their system. Unlike Trionex, Lyra Forge's leadership embraced my recommendations without reservation. They understood they were getting a rare opportunity to access supplier relationships that had taken years to build. When I suggested flying their head of materials science to Argentina to meet with a potential new partner, they arranged the trip within days. Dr. Elaine Winters, Lyra Forge's brilliant but socially awkward chief metallurgist, was skeptical at first. We've tried South American suppliers before, she told me on the flight to Salta. The quality control was inconsistent at best. This one is different, I promised. Wait until you see their process. The moment Elaine witnessed Gabriel's proprietary alloying technique, her skepticism vanished. By the end of the 3-day visit, she and Gabriel were finishing each other's sentences, sketching design modifications on napkins, and talking excitedly about possibilities that even I hadn't considered. This changes everything, Elaine told me on the return flight. With these alloys, our next-gen components will exceed specifications by at least 30%. We could redefine industry standards. I'm glad it worked out, I said mildly, as if I hadn't orchestrated this exact outcome, while Lyra Forge prepared for this new chapter. I kept tabs on Trionex through former colleagues who still reached out occasionally. Nathan had appointed Tom Ellison, a logistics manager with more ambition than experience, to take over my role. Tom had immediately begun implementing Nathan's supplier consolidation plan, apparently unaware of the time bomb ticking in the contract with Gabriel's workshop. The first sign of trouble came exactly 23 days after my departure. A routine shipment from Salta was held at customs in Buenos Aires. Under normal circumstances, I would have made a call to Carmen, resolved whatever documentation issue had arisen, and had the shipment released within hours. Tom, however, didn't know Carmen. He didn't know that she expected communications in Spanish, not English. He didn't know that she prioritized clearances based on personal relationships rather than corporate importance. So the shipment sat in a customs warehouse for 3 days before anyone at Trionex even realized there was a problem. By the time they sorted out the paperwork, the shipment was 5 days late, not catastrophic, but enough to disrupt production schedules and cause a minor panic among project managers who had grown accustomed to materials arriving precisely when needed. The second sign came a week later, when Gabriel's workshop failed to confirm the next scheduled order. Tom sent increasingly urgent emails, first to Gabriel's general business address, then to various staff members whose contact information he could find. None received replies. Finally, someone at Trionex thought to check the contract terms. That's when they discovered the non-transferability clause and the specific naming of Mara Keene as the authorized representative. According to the document, Gabriel was under no obligation to accept orders from anyone else at Trionex unless I personally approved the transfer of authority, which, of course, I had not. Panic ensued. Tom was summoned to an emergency meeting with Nathan and the legal department. They quickly determined that without Gabriel's alloys, production of their flagship Skystrata components would cease within weeks. Alternative suppliers existed, but none could provide the exact formulation that made their products superior. Switching would require extensive redesign and recertification, a process that would take months if not years. Nathan immediately tried to contact me, first through LinkedIn, then via email. Finally, through mutual connections, I ignored all attempts. watching the desperation build with each passing day. Meanwhile, at Lyra Forge, we were moving forward at an astonishing pace. The first test batches of Gabriel's alloys had arrived, and Elaine's team was already incorporating them into prototype components that outperformed anything on the market. Julia had begun quiet conversations with potential customers, hinting at a breakthrough that would be revealed in the coming quarter. I maintained a careful distance from the actual negotiations between Lyra Forge and Gabriel's workshop. My role was advisory only, providing context and introductions, but leaving the terms to be worked out between the parties directly. This wasn't just a legal precaution, though my lawyer had strongly advised it, but a genuine step back. I had initiated the connection, but its success would depend on these two companies building their own relationship of trust. The final shipment from Gabriel to Trionex arrived exactly on schedule. 38 days after my departure, it contained a normal quantity of their standard alloy, with no indication that it would be the last. Only Gabriel and I knew that the supply line was about to be permanently cut. 3 days later, Lyra Forge and Gabriel's workshop signed an exclusive supply agreement. The terms were favorable to both sides. Gabriel would receive higher margins and co-development credits on new applications, while Lyra Forge gained exclusive access to alloys that would transform their product line. The contract included no personal representation clause, a detail I noted with private satisfaction. This relationship didn't need to rely on a single individual. It was built on mutual respect and shared vision from the start. That evening, Gabriel sent Trionex Dynamics a formal letter terminating their supplier relationship, citing the breach of contract that occurred when they attempted to place orders through Tom rather than through me. The letter was polite, legally precise, and utterly devastating. The demolition had entered its final phase. Now came the collapse. The first public indication that something was seriously wrong at Trionex Dynamics came 53 days after my departure. An industry blog reported that delivery dates for their Skystrata components had been pushed back by at least 2 months. The company cited supply chain adjustments as the cause, a vague explanation that raised eyebrows throughout the aerospace sector. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. With their Argentinian supply line severed, Trionex's production floor had ground to a halt. Existing inventory of Gabriel's alloys had been depleted within weeks. Engineers were working around the clock to reformulate components using available materials, but the results were disappointing: heavier, less durable, and failing to meet the specifications their customers expected. Nathan had shifted from dismissive to desperate. After I continued to ignore his direct outreach, he sent Tom to my apartment with a handwritten letter offering me a strategic advisory position at double my previous salary. I didn't even open the envelope, simply returned it to Tom with a polite but firm request not to be contacted again. 68 days after my departure, Trionex missed its first major delivery deadline to Aerovance, one of the largest aircraft manufacturers in the world. Aerovance's production schedule was meticulously calibrated. Delays in component delivery cascaded throughout their system, potentially affecting aircraft delivery dates worth billions of dollars. The formal notice from Aerovance arrived the following day. Trionex had 30 days to resolve the supply issues, or Aerovance would invoke penalty clauses and begin seeking alternative suppliers. Nathan called an all-hands meeting to address the growing crisis. According to my sources still inside the company, he stood at the front of the packed auditorium, his former confidence replaced by a barely concealed panic. "This is a temporary setback," he assured the anxious employees. "We're in advanced negotiations with several world-class suppliers who can meet our material requirements. Production will resume at full capacity within weeks." It was a lie, and most people in the room knew it. The specialized alloys that had made Trionex components superior couldn't be replicated quickly, if at all. The advanced negotiations consisted of increasingly desperate calls to second-tier suppliers who might be able to provide something similar but certainly not identical. As Nathan spoke, the company's stock price was already beginning to slide. Financial analysts had picked up on the delivery delays and were asking pointed questions about Trionex's ability to meet contractual obligations. Institutional investors were quietly reducing their positions, sensing the approaching storm. 82 days after my departure, Lyra Forge made its move. They announced a new line of aerospace components called Quantum Forge that promised a 35% weight reduction compared to industry standards, a full 15% lighter than Tryonex's best offerings, while maintaining superior durability and heat resistance. The announcement included endorsements from 3 mid-sized aircraft manufacturers who had already placed orders for prototype installations. The aerospace materials industry is relatively small. Word spread quickly that LyraForge's breakthrough was connected to a new South American supplier with a proprietary alloying process. It didn't take long for people to connect the dots to Gabriel's workshop and my move to LyraForge. Nathan's response was predictable. 90 days after my departure, Tryonex Dynamics filed a lawsuit against me, alleging theft of trade secrets, intentional interference with contractual relationships, and breach of fiduciary duty. The complaint claimed I had deliberately sabotaged their supplier relationship with Gabriel's workshop and stolen proprietary information to benefit LyraForge. I had been expecting this. In fact, I had prepared for it long before I even left Tryonex. Deborah Van, my attorney, was a veteran of aerospace industry disputes with a reputation for ruthless efficiency. When the lawsuit arrived, she reviewed it calmly in her office while I sat across from her desk, watching her expression for any sign of concern. "They're desperate," she said finally, setting down the document. "This complaint is long on accusations and short on evidence." Can they prove I took anything proprietary?" I asked. "They can prove you had access to the information, and that you now work for a competitor that's suddenly thriving. That's circumstantial, but potentially troubling to a jury." She leaned forward. "However, their central claim that you interfered with their supplier relationship depends entirely on the terms of the contract with this Argentinian workshop." I smiled and pulled a folder from my bag, sliding it across the desk to her. "You mean this contract?" Deborah opened the folder and began reading the document inside, her eyebrows rising progressively higher as she absorbed the unusual terms. When she reached the handwritten annotation in the margin, explicitly naming me as the personal representative, she actually laughed out loud. "This is extraordinary," she said. "They're suing you for interfering with a contract that literally required your personal involvement. A contract they breached the moment they tried to place orders without you." "Exactly. And you have proof that the workshop terminated the relationship because of this breach." I handed her another folder containing Gabriel's termination letter to Tryonex, along with the email chain showing Tom's attempts to place orders directly. Deborah spent several minutes reviewing everything, occasionally making notes. Finally, she closed the folders and looked up at me with newfound respect. "Ms. Keene, I've been practicing law for 27 years, and I've rarely seen a position this defensible. They have no case. So how do we respond? Aggressively, we'll file a motion to dismiss, countersue for legal fees, and most importantly, we'll make sure every industry analyst and potential Tryonex customer knows exactly why their supply chain collapsed." Her smile turned predatory. "By the time we're done, Nathan Drake will be lucky to get a job managing a fast food restaurant." 3 days later, Deborah submitted our response to the court. Rather than a lengthy legal document, it consisted primarily of a single PDF, the original contract with Gabriel's workshop, with key sections highlighted and annotated to show exactly how Tryonex had breached its own terms. The response was copied to Tryonex's board of directors, major shareholders, and key customers. Within hours, it had been leaked to industry publications and was being discussed in hushed tones throughout the aerospace sector. Tryonex's lawsuit disappeared into silence. No further filings, no press releases, no public statements, just the awkward quiet of a company realizing it had publicly exposed its own incompetence. Meanwhile, the consequences of their supply chain collapse continued to mount. Aerovance formally invoked penalty clauses and began shifting future orders to competitors. 2 other major customers followed suit within days. Tryonex's stock price plummeted, losing 47% of its value in a single week. 112 days after my departure, Nathan Drake was removed as COO of Tryonex Dynamics. There was no official announcement, just a terse update to the leadership page on the company website. No farewell party, no golden parachute, no face-saving transition to an advisory role, just erasure, as if he had never existed. It was the beginning of the end. Department-wide layoffs began the following week. First in production, then in engineering, finally in administrative functions. The company that had employed over 800 people when I left now struggled to retain 200. The sprawling campus that had once hummed with activity became a ghost town of empty offices and idle machinery. Financial analysts began using terms like existential crisis and terminal decline in their reports on Trionex. Suppliers, sensing the company's weakness, began demanding payment up front. The board of directors held emergency meetings that stretched late into the night, desperately seeking a path to survival. 141 days after my departure, the final blow fell. Trionex's two largest lenders, citing material adverse change provisions in their loan agreements, called in their debts immediately, with production stalled, cash reserves depleted, and no viable path to resume normal operations. The company had no way to meet these obligations. 143 days after I walked out of the building for the last time, Trionex Dynamics filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy. The filing cited irreparable disruption to critical supply chains as the primary cause of failure. The company that had dismissed me as just a cog was now being dismantled and sold for parts. On the day Trionex's bankruptcy was announced, I was sitting in a small cafe in Salta with Gabriel, finalizing plans for an expanded production facility to meet Lyra Forge's growing needs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plaza outside, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh bread and coffee. Gabriel's phone buzzed with a news alert. He read it quietly, then passed the phone to me without comment. The headline was simple: Aerospace supplier Trionex Dynamics files for bankruptcy. I scanned the article quickly. It contained all the expected elements: a brief history of the company, quotes from industry analysts about supply chain failures, speculation about which competitors might acquire the valuable patents and equipment. There was a quote from Richard Treon, the retired founder, expressing shock and sadness at the company's demise. What the article didn't contain was any mention of me. No reference to the departed supply chain specialist who had taken the relationships that kept the company alive. No acknowledgement of the cog whose removal had caused the entire machine to seize and crumble. I handed the phone back to Gabriel, feeling a strange emptiness where I had expected satisfaction. The revenge I had orchestrated was complete, more devastating than I could have imagined. Yet the moment felt hollow. "Are you all right?" Gabriel asked, studying my expression. "Just thinking about all the people who lost their jobs," I said. "Most of them had nothing to do with Nathan's decision." Gabriel nodded slowly. "That is the tragedy of corporate warfare. The generals survive while the foot soldiers suffer." He paused, then added, "But remember, Mara, those jobs were already at risk. Nathan Drake was dismantling the company piece by piece. Your actions may have accelerated the inevitable, but you didn't cause it." I knew he was right, at least partially. Nathan's rationalization plans would have eventually destroyed what made Trionex special, even if more gradually. Still, I couldn't help feeling responsible for the collateral damage. "What matters now is what we build next," Gabriel continued, gesturing to the plans spread between us on the table. "Lyra Forge is creating something new, something better. Many of those who lost jobs at Trionex will find better ones in the companies that grow from this change." As if on cue, my phone chimed with an email from Julia. The subject line read, "Green light for expansion board approved full funding." The message contained enthusiastic approval for our proposed growth plan, including the new facilities in Salta and an aggressive hiring initiative focused on specialized engineers and technicians. The final paragraph caught my attention. P.S. We've received over 40 applications from former Trionex employees in the past week. Elaine is reviewing them personally. Many appear to be exceptional candidates who could accelerate our development timeline significantly. I showed the email to Gabriel, who smiled broadly. "You see, already the wheel turns again, with new cogs finding their places." We spent the next hour finalizing the details of our expansion plan. As we worked, I felt the emptiness inside me gradually filling with something else, not the vindictive satisfaction I had expected, but a quieter sense of purpose. I hadn't just destroyed something, I was helping to create something better. When we finished, Gabriel signed the last document with a flourish and raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said. I raised my cup to meet his. To new beginnings. As we walked out of the cafe into the bright Salta sunshine, Gabriel asked, "Will you ever tell them, the people at Lyra Forge? Will you tell them what really happened with Trionex?" I considered the question carefully. Some of them suspect already. Julia has never asked directly, but I think she understands. Elaine is too focused on the materials to care about corporate politics. I paused. The truth is, it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what we're building now. Gabriel nodded approvingly. A wise perspective. We stopped at the corner, where we would part ways, he to his workshop, I to my hotel. Before we said goodbye, Gabriel placed a hand on my shoulder. "For what it's worth, Mara, you were never a cog. Not to me, not to Richard, not to anyone who truly understood what you built." His eyes, wise with decades of experience, held mine steadily. "Remember that, when the ghosts of Trionex visit you at night." I thanked him, knowing he was right about the ghosts. They would come, questioning my choices, tallying the cost of my revenge. I would face them when they did. As I watched Gabriel walk away, a simple truth settled in my mind. Neither a justification nor an apology. Just a statement of fact. They called me a cog. I proved I was the engine, and now, that engine would power something new. In the months that followed, Lyra Forge grew at an astonishing rate. With Gabriel's alloys enabling their innovative designs, they quickly established themselves as the new standard in aerospace materials. Their quantum forge components began appearing in aircraft around the world, their lighter weight translating directly into fuel savings and reduced emissions. I settled into my role as strategic supply chain advisor, focusing on building sustainable, ethical sourcing relationships across South America and beyond. I made sure that every supplier we worked with was treated as a partner, not a commodity. I ensured that our contracts acknowledged the human elements that made our supply chain work, the relationships, the cultural considerations, the trust built over time. Occasionally, I would encounter former Trionex employees now working at Lyra Forge or other companies in the industry. Most were friendly, some were curious, a few were openly resentful. I treated them all with professional respect, neither hiding from my role in Trionex's demise nor boasting about it. The aerospace industry moved on quickly, as industries always do. Trionex dynamics became a cautionary tale, a case study in business schools about the dangers of disrupting established supply chains without understanding their foundations. Nathan Drake eventually resurfaced at a consumer electronics company, several levels down from his previous position, his reputation permanently tarnished. As for me, I continued to travel between our facilities in the United States and South America, building connections and solving problems. I visited Gabriel in Salta regularly, watching his workshop grow into a proper factory while still maintaining the craftsmanship that made his alloys special.